All right, we have two great speakers and a party for you next. Our next speaker is going to talk about the importance of design, about inspired design. And Michela O'Connor Abrams is the publisher and the president of Dwell. How many of you have read Dwell magazine or been to the Dwell website or events? Many of you. And how many of you love and are inspired by design? Yeah, that's what we marketers like, isn't it? Well, Michela is going to bring some beauty to your life right now, and she's going to attempt to answer, through some information that she's been gathering for quite a while, these two questions. They sound simple, but if you listen, they're quite tricky. The first one that she's going to answer is, what needs design most? And the second one is, how design matters. So for those of you that love beauty and design, please welcome Michela O'Connor Abrams. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Well, I don't know what's more daunting, being between you, the next speaker who's extraordinary, and a party, or someone talking about design who's got the microphone clipped to a little grab in her sweater. Which would mean that I should have thought of a better outfit to have discussed design, because after all, it really is everywhere and completely permeates everything that we do. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to tell you a little story, because I've not always been in the world of design from an intentional standpoint, and my career prior to Dwell was all about technology media. So, needless to say, to find that, hold on, let me make sure it's up on the screen. To find that this home that I lived in I'm not going to say what year, when I was very, very small. Anybody have an idea about what year this home was built? Can you tell the age of this home? I know this is not exactly the smallest crowd or conducive to answering these questions, but shout out anything. What year? The 40s. Okay, 1922, this is R.M. Schindler's first home. Meant to be the home of the Schindlers and the Neutras, together living in a communal way that would yield them a far richer life experience. And my father, unwittingly, having been transferred from the Bay Area to Los Angeles, went and rented this home from Pauline Schindler and was supposed to take care of the cat named Puss and have this be our family home. We were leaving this Tudor home in the Oakland Hills, and all I can tell you, the shortest version, is when my mother and I pull up after I've gotten out of school and drive to Los Angeles. It was 110 degrees. It broke all records, and she drives up to this, having left the Tudor mansion, and said, you know, God damn it, David, what have you done? So this was, though, a place for me that was the most exciting place I could ever imagine living. And we then left the home, lost the cat, returned the home to Pauline Schindler, and moved to a house 15 miles away across the street from this iconic Lautner home called Silvertop, sitting on 5 city lots, originally built by the gentleman who invented the ladies' clippy for curls and went on to restore the Watts Towers, and he is actually still alive, and we are going to be celebrating John Lautner's 100th birthday this summer, and he is going to be there. This was an extraordinary home, so this was my playground. And off the balcony of our home, right across Silver Lake, was this home. And this was Neutra's home and studio, and went on to be sold to a family that I grew up with. And so the idea that you would move from Schindler, across the street from Lautner, and across the lake from Neutra, and never really think about that significance until many years later, when you end up starting and developing a media company with a founder all about the impact of good design. that is intentionally modern. All the time, this is what was going on everywhere else in the country. The complete destruction of millions of acres of land that developers felt was the new horizon for people in this country who wanted their own brand spanking new home and who had choice. Which place did you want the gable? Over the front door, over the garage, over the mini bay window in the front? Those were your choices, plan A, B, and C, and oh, the size probably mattered too. Other than that, you were now a member of a grid. The idea that this home, built at the same time that all of the onslaught of tract homes was going on, could not be replicated or proliferated was really sad. Because this was built at the same time in the 60s, looking like a piece of timber that fell in the forest on the lot where it lived for about the same price that it cost to buy a tract home. So from the time that I was 9, living in the Schindler home, to the time that is now 2002, and I decide that I've had a lot of fun in technology, but what I would love to do is help somebody build a brand, not a publishing company, build a brand that essentially made the idea of bringing a brand to everyone, anywhere, anytime, any place, and in any form, was possible, exciting, and it was the future. And so I found the woman who owned that shack in downtown Mill Valley, and who, through a process of just her own exploration, no experience of any kind in design, but knew that she wanted to build a different home than this one after a while. And that is what it became. And that is still there. And she still lives in it with now her husband and twins. That is the home that inspired Dwell. Because the thought was, why can't we have a place where you can live the way you want to live in a home that expresses your authenticity? That the design really is not a language or a profession only. It is something that each of us has in our own DNA, our capacity of which depends on how much we exercise it. So whether it is a beautiful loft on top of a historic building in Manhattan, or it is this second home owned by a couple who retired from Microsoft on a piece of land in Whidbey Island that allowed every tree to be mowed down if that's what the couple chose. And instead, they built this very sweet home and cut down 3 trees. Or it's the urban infill solution in a neighborhood that's just returning. And this changes the entire environment for everybody who lives in the neighborhood. Or the gentleman who is a musician and wanted his home to not only express his authenticity, but be a place that everything he did in the music industry was right there in his home. He said, this is my whole life. So this has to be a place that I go to and bring people to and imagine everything that is possible in my life happening here. And he bought a piece of land, saw a cover of Dwell from 2 years prior, and built this home that is a sound studio and a music recording studio, and did so for $58 a square foot. And some of you may say, well, it looks like $58 a square foot. In fact, I've seen Quonset huts that look better than that. But for him, this was exactly what he had dreamed of. And after all, isn't that what it's about? It's not about somebody else making that decision for you. A studio, a ballet studio, and a 5,000 square foot home on the Gold Coast of Australia. A home for $50 a square foot, 5,000 square feet, that is lived in by a family who has an incredible relationship with the community and the neighbors in this place in Montana. And this home was welcomed, and it was almost like a barn raising. Or this home, inspired by the container living, but wooded and expressed in a way that sat beautifully on this piece of property, and inside is all full of the light and the life of this architect, designer, and their 3 children. $110 a square foot. Or this little studio, this writing studio atop a building in Amsterdam. Or the bachelor pad in Fort Worth, Texas, that was meant to just be a place where the best parties on earth could happen. Or a home in North Carolina that was designed to be the launch of the Dwell Homes collection. Because we have a belief that prefab, which is not a double-wide trailer, is actually a building system that can mean many things, and it's volumetric, and it can be panelized, and it can be a kit of wood, is a very real, sustainable way to continue building. And the silver lining to the housing crisis, if one can even call it that, the silver lining, I don't mean the crisis, sorry, is that all of those developers building 5,000 and 10,000 homes at a time on this entitled land have come to a screeching halt, because we haven't even begun to absorb the homes in foreclosure. And so all the time that this has been happening, the Dwell Homes collection has expanded by almost 65 homes. Homes that express the owner's authenticity, that are in beautiful places all over the world. We just shipped one to North Korea and one to South Korea. We are looking at ways in which we can express good design in the eyes of that owner of sound, sustainable architecture. Let's look at something else for a moment that helps us understand why design matters so much, even when it has constraints. Here's safety, right? We have to have lights on the back of the cars that we drive, not to mention the ones that are in front of us. And there are constraints, but there are still ways to express design and brands, and how many of us look at those and try to guess which brand it is or what we're driving behind because of the shape of that tail light. Here's another reason, going back to some land, why it matters so much. We call these things such ridiculous names. Whispering oaks, whispering because there are no oaks there. Canyon woods, neither a canyon nor a wood left. Generations, I don't know about you, but I don't need to move into a place where somebody's going to tell me how many people of different ages live in the place that I'm choosing to live. Clearly, design can renew in a beautiful way that preserves the historic story, not just the preservation of the physical building, the story that those buildings tell of communities that were there and that left legacies that are important to preserve, not replicate in some strange way that our predecessors, ancestors would say, what the hell are you doing with the technology and the capabilities you have? You weren't meant to be nostalgic in the way that meant recreating something that is past. It's doing something appropriate for this century that gives preservation the right context and connotation. Design can reinvigorate, we know that. And what I've done is give you 3 examples of what everyone at Dwell thinks needs design's help the most. And then I have a question for you. So public transportation, is there anybody who disagrees with me on that? How about the sea of cubes? And the way that even though we need to fit an efficient number of people into a square foot grid model, it isn't humanly the way people really work productively, because you squeeze every ounce of creativity out of people when you put them here, the same way you do when you put them on a grid in a neighborhood that allows for authenticity to be expressed by one design element. Almost as if somebody said, which veneer would you like to be today? Or how about the bulb? We're getting better. We're definitely getting better and coming up with technologies in this area that help. We don't have lighting fixtures for them, however, but We're hopeful that our new design competition will help solve that problem also. And so, we wonder what you think the world needs good design the most. Where is it that you think we've failed the most? That if we cared about design enough and we employed all the basic tenets of good design, that we would really improve whatever it is you think. And of course, I want you to find me on Twitter at Michela Abrams and tell me that, or Sam at dwell.com, the editor-in-chief. Both of us really want to know. So, really, in closing, I will tell you that design is in absolutely everything you do. This building, the way that they created pathways for you to get into these buildings, the chairs you're sitting on, the way you're sitting in them, the way that you interact with everything in the building helps describe what experience you will have at AdTech. Of course, you don't always consciously identify with any one of those things unless your back is killing you or you really have some aversion to these chairs or large buildings or any of those afflictions. It is critically important. And what we know, at least, is that in this country for the last 10 years, every single industry that you can think of has used design as a differentiator. And if you look at the top companies, whether it's transportation like Virgin America or it's technology like Apple, and go down the list of financial services and director Charles Schwab and make your list, every one of them has used design to leverage a better position than their competitor. Thank you so very much.
That was inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Susan.
Yeah, wasn't that great? It makes you really remember how important it is for us individually to fight for great design. Because if we don't do it, it doesn't get done, right? Last speaker before Beer 30 is Mark Joyner. Many of you probably know of Mark. He's somewhat of an internet marketing legend. He's written 10 books, some New York Times bestsellers. And what Mark has done with a lot of his success is recreate from the ground up the kind of chairman and CEO, the kind of organization that he wants to create. It has a philanthropic bent to it. And Mark is going to tell you about this thing he calls, in shorthand, DC3D. He has a company called Construct Zero, and Construct Zero is a holding company of many organizations, all of whom have been created both for profit and to fund the constructzero.org philanthropy for dirt cheap, and I have to read this, dirt cheap decentralized distribution devices. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Mark Joyner with a very big vision. Thank you.
Said that Bucky Fuller's defining moment was when he was contemplating suicide on a bridge. And he thought, instead of killing himself, why don't I just ask myself a really profound question? I mean, I'm going to die anyway, so what if I were to remain alive without any of the constraints or preconceived notions about what my life was supposed to be like? Now, my moment came in a rather different situation. In 2005, I just sold off the businesses I was running, and I was in de facto retirement, and I'm sure if anybody here who's tried it, they'll concur. Retirement is seriously overrated. I couldn't stand a couple days of inactivity, let alone the prospect of a whole lifetime of it. So I decided to ask myself a rather Fuller-esque question. What could I do to create the biggest possible impact in the world? So I started by looking at what I think are the world's three biggest problems. War is the obvious first answer. Wasted brain power. You might not think this is a big problem, but it's summed up very beautifully by this old adage. PhD in physics is the surest path to a position in management at McDonald's. Now, deprivation. You guys probably don't think this is a big problem here, but as you'll see here in a moment, it's actually a lot bigger than you think. It's getting bigger. So as I was contemplating these ideas, it struck me that one of these problems was really the key to all three: deprivation. So I thought, what if we were to redesign the world so that there was no lack, so that everyone in the world had unfettered access to everything that they needed? Water, food, clothing, sanitation, electricity, internet access even. What if it was all just there? Now, of course, I'm not talking about some socialistic notion of redistribution of wealth. What I'm talking about here is a state of technological advancement, where this is just an empirical fact, not some kind of a system that has to be maintained through coercion. So what would happen if we did this? Well, the wasted brain power problem would be no more. I mean, if people aren't pursuing their dreams because they have to make compromises in order to gain access to the basic necessities of life, if we had unlimited access to these things, everything would be very, very different. Now, we'd be asking ourselves different questions, wouldn't we? Instead of waking up in the morning and thinking, what am I doing in this job? Another day of this crap. We'd say, what can I invent today? What can I explore today? Wouldn't that be an awesome morning to wake up to? Now, as for war, I think that this theory holds as well. Being a student of history, I used to believe that war was the battle of ideologies and egos, but upon further examination, you can also view it as all being tied to resources. The ideologies that are used to justify war are really just being carrier waves for greater frustrations. So think about it. I mean, what really happens when we go to war? We have a small number of people who make a decision, and then we have mass influence that convinces everyone to support the war effort. But this wouldn't be possible if we had unlimited access to everything we needed to survive. Surely in this hypothetical future, we'd have megalomaniacs, but their efforts to garner support for war wouldn't be so successful. When they said, we've got to go attack the enemy, otherwise they'll take away all of our resources, the people at large would know this to be false, as an empirical fact. So how then does one solve this problem of mass deprivation? I mean, surely it's got to be a logistical impossibility, otherwise it would have already been done, right? I mean, who's going to control the manufacturing plants that provide the basic necessities of life for everyone in the whole world? And how can we possibly distribute these things to everyone in an economical way? And how can we also make sure that the people who control this distribution chain aren't abusing it for personal gain? So I had a thought. What if we were to address this problem in a way that no one had yet considered? And what if all of the previous assumptions we had about the most effective way to address this issue were all false? So since I had the freedom to look at this problem from a totally clean slate, I asked myself, what if we were to design the solution that had the greatest possibility of success? What would this look like? Well, the first new assumption is that there had to be no central point of failure. Now, when I hypothesized earlier that deprivation was the root cause of the world's biggest problems, we could probably improve that statement a little bit by saying that really centralized control of the world's resources is the cause of the world's biggest problems. I mean, if they're under centralized control, a small number of people could capriciously take away access to all these things. So whatever solution I came up with, I had to make sure that it was decentralized in nature. Next, I realized that the solution had to be mimetic in nature. That is, it couldn't be physical per se, because then we'd have to overcome the Herculean constraints associated with mass distribution logistics. So this had to be one hell of a meme we were devising here. Now finally, while this meme wasn't physical, it had to result in a real-world consequence. Now, some might say, Mark, the answer is already here. It's capitalism. Maybe they're right. And I'm not here to debate politics. But Adam Smith's ideas have been around for a long time, yet mass deprivation still exists. So if the solution resulted in a real-world consequence, objects that people could hold in their hands and use, they wouldn't need any convincing about adopting a particular system. In the same way that the introduction of the cell phone resulted in radical societal shifts, the change caused by the introduction of these objects would be instant and permanent. So the solution was to invent a class of devices that I call DC3D. That's short for dirt cheap, Decentralized distribution devices. That's a mouthful, hence the acronym. So what does that mean? Well, dirt cheap means it has to be a device that costs less than $5 US to make. Decentralized means it has to be able to function without connection to some kind of a centralized distribution system. Distribution means it has to be a point of distribution in itself, and more specifically, it has to distribute or make available some of the basic necessities of life. And device simply means that it has to be an object that does something. It can't be vapor. Now, I was rather happy with the solution, but there was one really big problem that these didn't solve. See, while these overcome the challenge of having to have a centralized mass distribution network, how then are we going to get these devices in people's hands? So here's how we'll overcome that. While we're going to own the patents for these devices, we're going to allow anyone in the world to produce these royalty-free. Now, the really cool thing about this is when the plans for these devices are available on the net, no petty tyrants in the world would ever be able to stop their distribution, no matter how disruptive they find them to their own personal agendas, which I think is kind of cool. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment the impact these devices would have in the world. What if everyone in the world had unlimited access to water, to free electricity, to a freely available, nutrient-rich food supply? And in later devices, we even hope to provide unlimited, uncensorable access to the internet. What would your life be like, and what would that world be like to live in? Now, before I leave you with a couple of really interesting closing thoughts, I want to share with you for a moment here how our organization is structured and also how we're going to go about doing this. We're really 3 organizations in one. Susan was saying earlier, ConstructZero.com is sort of a conglomerate organization, something resembling the Japanese Keiretsu model, and a portion of the profits from that are funding ConstructZero.org, and that is the research and development center. We're actually going to be building and testing the prototypes of these devices, and the patents are going to be held in something we're calling the World Heritage Technology Foundation. Now, we have 5 distinct growth phases before we'll actually get into the real fun. Phase 0, the first phase, is already complete. Up until now, we were a rather far-flung organization with myself and a few team members in an office in New Zealand, and the rest of our 40 staff members spread out all over the world. But we're now consolidating everything in San Bruno, and we're hiring locally. Now, phases 1 to 3 are some secret commercial objectives we have that'll provide the funding for phase 4. See, we realize that we've got to fund this out of our own pockets. Otherwise, our objectives would be sullied by the agenda of our donors. And I think that these objectives are important enough to ensure that they remain unmolested in that way. And phase 4 is going to be the groundbreaking of our R&D campus, and that's where we're going to be flying in scientists and engineers from all over the world to work on these projects. Now, I want to leave you with 2 thoughts. One on a more somber note that's underscoring the urgency of this project, and one that offers a small glimmer of hope. First, here's a chart from the United Nations Population Reference Bureau, and it shows the current population growth projections. As you can see, we're expected to break 10 billion by 2050. Now, we're about 7 billion now, pretty close to it. Now, what's really alarming about this chart is that almost all of this growth is in developing nations. Very little of it is in the industrialized world. Now, in closing, I want to share with you 3 bizarre inventions that really give me a lot of hope. British inventor Josh Silver, he's a former professor of physics at Oxford, and he invented this ingenious device. Now, you might look at this and say, Mark, this is just a pair of glasses, and you'd be correct. But there's one little tiny difference. These glasses have an adjustable prescription based on pressure of a layer of water sitting in between 2 lenses on each side. Now, what's cool about this is you can mass produce one single universal device. So this drives the cost of these glasses way down compared to normal prescription lenses, which is pretty amazing. Now, here's another rather clever device. It's among the closest I've seen yet to a valid DC 3D. It's not quite there yet, but it shows a lot of hope. This young kid, John Lau, invented this simple device, and it uses heat from the sun and condensation to create pathogen-free drinking water. One of these devices will create 3 liters of water per day. Now, again, it lacks many of the traits that we'll demand of our DC 3Ds, but it shows a lot of promise. Now, finally, what you see here is a mock-up of a rather bizarre and radical proposal from British inventor George Pike in World War II. See, in World War II, the biggest constraint in developing aircraft carriers was access to steel. And as the war effort marched on, access to these resources became more and more scarce. So George Pike had a radical notion. He said, instead of using steel, what if we built aircraft carriers out of ice? This sounds like a crazy proposal. But knowing that seemingly crazy ideas are sometimes the source of the world's biggest breakthroughs, Churchill actually funded this project, believe it or not. Now, as you might imagine, there were a few constraints that they had to overcome in this. First of all, ice has two rather interesting properties. One is it's very brittle, and it also melts. These are not things that are desirable for an aircraft carrier. So George Pike, optimist that he was, he invented a new substance to overcome this problem. He called it pykrete. Pykrete is the simple addition of wood chips to water that's then frozen. Now, this doesn't sound like much, but the simple addition of wood chips had two rather unexpected effects. First, it made it extremely impact resistant. And next, it took significantly longer to melt. Now, so much so that the 50-foot pykrete aircraft carrier that they created, this prototype, took an entire year to melt. The point of all this? Well, if commonly available materials can be used in such unexpected ways to dramatic impact, who's to say that the goals of DC-3D are not possible? See, I don't think we need new technological breakthroughs to make this work. What we need are the right scientists and the right engineers, uncorrupted by the prejudices of the less open-minded of their profession, with the right funding and the right leadership. So what we're talking about here is possible, and if we can do it, we must do it. So in closing, I'd like to ask you to think for just a moment about the impact of technology on our society. One can look at history, real history, mind you, not as the soap opera of which leader was better at bamboozling a nation, but instead as the story of technology. Leaders have come and gone. Entire cultures have come and gone. But technology, it carries with it this mimetic spark. It's passed on from generation to generation. We don't know who first harnessed the power of fire, but we pay silent tribute to this guy every time we heat our homes. The challenge is, while this fire heats your homes, it also heated the ovens of Auschwitz. True history is the story of technology, but more specifically, it's the story of how technology has either enhanced or taken away our liberty. I say we absolutely must focus our energies on developing technologies that enhance our liberty. And if we feel that this is out of our grasp, that perhaps we don't yet possess the technological wizardry required to make a significant impact, I would remind you that sometimes all you need is a little bit of water and a pile of wood chips. Thank you.
A little bit of water, a pile of wood chips, and a beer.
And a beer. All right.
I wanted to thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
I really want to thank Brad. Brad is the person that pushed to create this half-day event, and I'd love for you to give him a round of applause. Yeah! Woo!
Thank you, Susan.
You deserve that.
I couldn't do that without you. Now is the time to start drinking. So I thank everybody for coming. We have a reception that's going to be happening right out there. It's a great time to mix and mingle, and we're going to get going with our opening keynote tomorrow at 9. Thank you so much for coming. Please retweet the YouTube link and be here bright and early tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming to AdTech Inspire.